All right, this is the first day that we're going to talk about graphing trig functions. So this is new to a lot of you, if not most of you. And specifically, we are going to graph sine and cosine. So what I've done up here, I went ahead and made a table that we're going to fill in to help us graph it. So if you want to go ahead and try to pause this for a second, see if you can fill in the table, and then unpause it, and see if you got it right. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. All right, if you try to fill it out, here's what's important to understand. The x values are all angles, okay? So they're angles for sine and cosine. They're going in where x is. It's easier to think of them as an input. The y values are an output. So when you're looking at your unit circle, okay, I'm going to start with cosine first. When I fill in 0, I'm really figuring out cosine of 0. We know cosine is your x coordinates. So my x coordinate at angle 0 for cosine is 1. Fill it in. My x-coordinate at pi over 2 is 0. My x-coordinate at pi is -1. My x-coordinate at 3 pi over 2 is 0. And my x-coordinate at 2 pi, the angle 2 pi, it gets me back to 1 again. I'm going to go over to sine now. Sine is real similar. I'm filling in these values for x, so they're angles. Okay, we know sine represents your y-coordinate. So my y-coordinate at angle 0, ends up being 0. My y-coordinate at pi over 2 is 1. Okay, my y-coordinate at pi, at angle pi ends up being 0. My y-coordinate at 3 pi over 2 is -1. And my y-coordinate at 2 pi gets me back to 0. What we're going to do is use this table to graph those trig functions. Okay, this is the first part of the notes that we're going to use to graph the trig functions in a minute when I do the table. So if you want to go ahead and write these down and possibly pause it, I'm going to go and explain what they mean. Okay, if you read up here, okay, the functions y equals a sine bx and y equals a cosine bx, they have 5 main points in each graph that you're going to see when I graph them. They're the main points that we did in our table. Okay? A and B are going to be numbers, and so they're going to help us identify a few things. First thing we want to identify, okay, in each of the graphs is the period. Okay, the period is how long it takes a function to complete one cycle. So the sine and cosine functions, they keep repeating the same pattern. Okay, we're just going to graph one cycle, and you can find that by doing 2 pi divided by b. Okay, and b is always the number in front of x. Okay. The distance from the middle y value to the highest or lowest y value in a graph is known as the amplitude. Okay, and the amplitude is always the absolute value of a, which is the number out front of sine and cosine. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the basic graph then for sine. Okay, y equals sine x. Notice how there's no number out front and there's no number next to x, so this is the real basic graph on it. Our period, okay, for sine or cosine, it doesn't matter, is 2 pi divided by b. B is the number in front of x. In this case, the number in front of x is 1. So 2 pi divided by 1 is still 2 pi. So I'm going to write that in. The amplitude is the absolute value of the number out front of sine or cosine. Okay, again, since there's not a number out front of sine or cosine, that is also 1. Okay, so here's what that means. Okay, this graph has 5 main points. Okay, this graph, which I need to put up here, is going to start with an x value of 0. So it's going to start right around here. It's going to end with an x value of 2 pi. Okay, so it's going to end with a x value of 2 pi. What I know then, after I write that in, what I know is that there's 5 main points in this graph, just like on our table. Okay, so to divide this into 5 points, the easiest way to do it is put a line right in the middle, okay, the first point and the last point, and then divide each of those in half. Okay, and that'll give us 5 points that are equal, have an equal distance in between them. Okay? In order to label these points, okay, I am going to divide 2 pi by 4. And the reason is there are 4 spaces between 0 and 2 pi. Okay, so I'm going to divide this by 4. You figure out when you divide 2 pi by 4, you get pi over 2. So if I count by pi over 2's, so pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, you get the 5 points when you start at 0. My amplitude up here I wrote was 1, so that means this graph will go as high as 1. and as low as -1. Now, here's the basic pattern of sine. If you go back to our table and you fill in the values, okay, when you put 0 in for x, okay, you got 0 in for y. I'm just going back to the table. When you put pi over 2 for x, okay, your output was 1. When you put pi in, your output was 0. When you put 3 pi over 2 in on your table for sine, your output was -1. And when you put 2 pi in, your output was 0 again. So the sine graph, okay, will always look like that, okay, the basic graph. I like to prefer saying that the first point is the middle, the second one's the highest, the third point is the middle, the fourth one is the lowest, and the fifth is the middle. So I say sine has the pattern of middle, high, middle, low, middle. And the range that we have here talks about your y values. Notice how the y values are in between -1 and 1. Okay, now we're going to look at the cosine graph, same way we did with the sine graph. Okay, if you notice, same period, 2 pi divided by b ends up giving you 2 pi. The amplitude ends up being the same. There's not a number out front, so we assume it's a 1. Okay, this is going to start at 0. It's going to travel a distance of 2 pi. So I'm really going to set it up the same way. So I have that first point, a point at the end. I will divide that distance in half, and each one of those in half. Okay, since I have 4 spaces, I know what I'm counting by if I do 2 pi divided by 4, okay, which again is pi over 2. So go ahead and fill that in. And this graph also has an amplitude of 1, so the graph is going to go as high as 1 and as low as -1. For the pattern for cosine, again, if you go back to the table, I'm going to fill in these x coordinates for my input, and I already wrote down the y coordinates from the table. So cosine's pattern, if you look at the table, okay, when I fill in 0, I get 1. When I filled in pi over 2, I got 0. When I filled in pi, I got -1. When I filled in 3 pi over 2, I got 0. And when I filled in 2 pi, I got 1 again. Okay, so if I connect those, okay, that's the general pattern for cosine. So cosine really goes high, middle, low, middle, high. Okay, that's the pattern for the 5 points. Starts out high, middle, low, middle, high. And again, just like sine in this case, my range of my y values is -1 to 1. Okay, let's go ahead and look at some examples where you actually have a number in for the a and the b. So you have a number out front and you have a number next to x. Okay? The period, we talked about the period on the last one, is 2 pi divided by b. So 2 pi divided by b. B in this case is the number in front of x, which is 4. Okay, so your period ends up being 2 pi over 4, or if you reduce it, pi over 2. Okay, for that. The amplitude. Okay, the amplitude is the number, the absolute value of the number out front. Okay, it's 2. So my amplitude would be 2. So what this means is this graph starts with the next value of 0, just like the other ones. It travels a distance of pi over 2, so that's where it would end. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and fill these in up here. So this is starting here at 0, it's ending at pi over 2, and I'm going to have my 5 main points, so again, I will divide this in half, and each of these in half. Okay, now what I need to do is I need to figure out what I'm counting by for each of the tick marks that go with the x value. So my whole distance all the way across from 0 to pi over 2 is pi over 2. And I got 4 things, 4 gaps that I need to add together to equal that. So it makes sense that what you're going to do is you're going to divide the distance, okay, the period, by 4, and that'll tell you what you're going to get to count from one x value to the next. I think it's easier, instead of dividing by 4, that's the same as multiplying by 1/4, so you can figure out it's pi over 8. Okay, so that's really what I'm counting by. So I'm going to count by pi over 8, and I'm not even going to reduce. So pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8. And then if I add it again, I get 4 pi over 8, which is pi over 2. So it should match up. And I know my amplitude is 2, so this is going to go as high as 2. Okay, this graph will go as low as -2. And now I can draw my graph as long as I know the pattern for sine. So if you remember, the pattern for sine is middle for the first point, high for the second, middle for the third, low for the fourth, middle for the fifth. Okay. So that's what the graph would look like. My range in this case, I know the y values range between -2 and +2. Okay, my last problem that we're going to do in here, 3 cosine pi x over 5. Okay, my period, I'm going to write up here, is 2 pi divided by, in this case, the number in front of x, the b, is pi over 5. So that is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So what ends up happening is the pi's cancel and you get 10. So your period doesn't have pi in it, which is perfectly fine. Your amplitude, the number out front, okay, the absolute value of it is 3. So that means this graph will go as high as 3 and as low as -3. So this graph is going to start with an x value of 0, starting point with an x value of 0. It's going to end with an x value of 10. Okay? So again, I know it's ending with an x value of 10. I'll divide that in half, and each one of those in half. If I divide 10 by 4, I figure out that I'm counting by 2.5s. Okay, so I'll go ahead and count by 2.5s to get from one x to the next. And again, I know my amplitude is going all the way up to 3, all the way down to -3. Okay, so on this problem, I can go ahead and graph it, as long as I know the pattern. The pattern for cosine, you start out with the highest point, then its middle, then the lowest, then the middle, then the highest. Okay, so that would be the graph for cosine. And then what I know, the range, my y values range from -3 to +3. Okay, real quickly, I want to show you if you can check if your answer is right. So what you need to do first is you need to go to mode, make sure you're in radian mode, which I am. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to type in the equation that I just tried to find the answer for. Okay, so 3 cosine pi x divided by 5. Pi x divided by 5. Okay, if you hit graph, it won't mean much to you. What you got to do is you got to go up to your window. So I'm going to hit window, and I'm going to type in what I found my information to be. So I started with an x value of 0. I ended with an x value of, let's see, 10. Think about it for a minute. Okay, I was counting by an x value of 2.5. Okay, my y value, the smallest y value, my graph went down to -3. And it went up to +3. Okay, so if I fill those in and I hit graph, it should be the same picture that I just tried to draw. Okay, it should fill in the same picture, which it does, and that's an easy way to check your answer. When you're done, if you want to get your window back to the original setting, just hit zoom, and zoom standard, which is 6, and it will go ahead and reset your window back to the original setting.